Welcome to Kingdoms in Conflict. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Wallace. On August 9th, 2014, Michael Brown was shot and killed by police officer Darren Wilson. Brown's death helped spark the Black Lives Matter movement's rise that suggested that white police officers were gunning down blacks. Protesters took to the streets chanting, "Hands up, don't shoot," creating a narrative that incited the black community and even the world that said Brown was an innocent victim of police brutality. But was this narrative true? People even today are still touting that narrative. We will again talk to Dr. Shelby Steele, author, social commentator, and research fellow at the Hoover Institution and Stanford University, about his film, What Killed Michael Brown, when we return. Welcome to Kingdoms in Conflict. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Wallace. And again, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Shelby Steele. Thank you for joining us again, sir.
Thanks for having me again.
You know, I had a chance to interview Bob Woodson, the 1776, and I noticed that your face was there and that you're doing some writing for them. How is that going? What is your role with 1776?
Well, Bob and I are friends, and I interviewed Bob in my last movie. So, What Killed Michael Brown, and so we sort of, out of that time we spent together, he came up, and then we both went back home our separate ways, and he in the meantime came up with this idea to respond to the New York Times article that had argued 1619 Project, that argued that we were victims, and so America was really a society conceived in race and so forth. And so we just talked about it. He came out to see me in California at the Hoover Institution. We talked to some other people. We got finally, through his his dogged determination, this project emerged of 1776, being really the year that America was, the real America was formed. That it was not in 1619, where America, the implication being that America was born out of slavery and out of man's inhumanity to man. Woodson's 1776 project is the opposite. Here is a noble vision of man that America was born out of, and this is the one we have to live up to. So I've been involved in that to a degree.
Okay, so the idea is, 1619 is trying to rewrite history with a different slant, and 1776 is trying to actually portray history as it actually happened, not how people want to, yeah. Which is something that you're actually doing in a movie that you talked about, that you happened to mention, What Killed Michael Brown. So tell our audience a little bit about the movie, and what's it about? What are you trying to do in the movie? When it's coming out, when can people look for it, that kind of thing.
October 16th.
Okay.
October 16th, it will be out, and the website is whatkilledmichaelbrown.com. So we're excited to go around and talk about it, build up some interest in it. I hope it has a good life. We try to explore the conflict you just alluded to in this film. Michael Brown is a young black kid shot by a white policeman in Ferguson, Missouri, about 6 years ago. And so we then went, in the last couple of years, spent a lot of time there in Ferguson, got to know the people. So we want to get the background of this story. People in government, all the way from the President of the United States, Obama, Attorney General Eric Holder, all these people were involved in this incident that we found revolved around what we're calling a poetic truth, which is that Michael Brown was killed by American racism, that he was shot by a white cop who was racist. and killed, and that therefore Black Americans are still at high risk. Racism against Black Americans is still their number one problem, and so forth and so on. Our point of view is that that is absolutely not the literal objective truth. That is a poetic truth, a truth twisted in a way to meet a political goal, a political end, to win things from the larger society, social programs. We have what we call a grievance industry in America today, where people, in a sense, profit from the accusation that America's racist. Well, here's black kid, white cop. Boy, it looks like racism. So people went crazy. They thought it was just rippling with power, rippling with opportunity to squeeze the larger society for all sorts of payoffs and benefits. And so our examination was to look at this sort of symbiotic relationship between Black victimization and white guilt, and see where America is at today with regard to all of that.
I'm really interested in hearing this because we all understand that with the death of Michael Brown, it actually helped launch Black Lives Matter, and they always include Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. Again, back to your, poetic truth, that Trayvon Martin wasn't shot by anyone he was. First of all, wasn't shot by a police officer, and second, he wasn't the guy who shot him wasn't white. He's supposedly Latino. And then we get to Michael Brown, and Michael Brown, the whole narrative at first was hands up, don't shoot. So do you go through meticulously how things actually happened? Do you get rid of the myth?
We go through the event itself, the background. I'm very proud of how thorough my son is, the filmmaker, and he worked very hard to line up the actual shooting and what happened, and then what happened, and then what happened. And so the viewer of the film sees the reality exactly as it did happen. And then you see the poetic truth, which is the attempt by so many other people to exploit what really happened by saying, just because, as we say, just because there was a white trigger finger, it began to replicate that American history of white racism against Black victims. And that's the poetic truth. It's a lie completely. We show that, we prove that. There are all sorts of government grand jury investigations that established it was not that in any way. But even today, when it's been disproved by two different grand juries and by the Justice Department, there's still people in Ferguson who believe Michael Brown was the victim of white racism. Because white racism, here's our point, white racism has become, since the 60s, since we realized that white people will pay off if they just discover, there will be a huge reaction. You will get all sorts of attention programs, so forth and so on. In other words, we as Blacks began to feel that our victimization was our power in American life. And the most sacred thing to us since the 60s has been our victimization. Don't you question that. If you question our victim, and you say, tell me I'm not a victim of racism, and that Black people generally are no longer held back by racism, you'll suffer my fate. You'll be called an Uncle Tom, you'll be called a traitor to your race, you'll be called every name in the book, you will be canceled, and so forth, because you are seeming to threaten the most important source of power we have, which is our victimization. And this is, we again show this. It's the liberalism, the public housing and so forth, the culture of public housing, of school busing, of affirmative action, of diversity this and diversity that, of the government and whites generally assuaging us and throwing things at us, giving us things that produce a Michael Brown, a kid who virtually commits suicide by cop, who attacks a white cop.
Now, was it true that he was the one who had, robbed that convenience store?
Yes, he robbed a convenience store. We have that on film, in the film, the day before and just before the event itself. He was down the street doing that. I have a lot of compassion for Michael Brown.
Mm-hmm.
He, of all of the maladies that come out of liberalism in the 60s, where they take over Black life and just continue to treat us as though we're helpless victims and give us this, that, so forth. They steal away from Black people their own power to agent their own life. The liberalism keeps saying, we're smarter than you, we can solve your problems. You just do what we tell you to do.
Another form of slavery.
I won't mention any presidential candidates here. I won't allude to any.
Well, we're not Black and we don't vote for him.
There you see the white guilt in making whites feel it's a good thing to take over the problems Blacks have. But when you do that, you dehumanize Blacks. You make them, you reduce them to being mere victims. You want Michael Brown to be a victim. You don't want him to be a free man.
Some of the biggest fans of this whole victimization piece are people who have achieved individually, like football players, basketball players. LeBron James comes out and tells us, how Black people are afraid, and they use Michael Brown, and they kind of exaggerate all this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they exaggerate all this to try and again play the victim role to get white people, I guess, to do something to try and fix this problem. But all the while, their life is a testimony as what you can do on your own, right? I mean, am I right here? So actually, they're the example of what Black people need to be doing. People like Ben Carson and others outside of sports and entertainment. I argued with somebody the other day, and I said that, Blacks have become millionaires we want to talk about disparities, okay? And I don't know how you feel about disparities, but in certain areas, but nobody talks about the overrepresentation of Black people in the NBA or the NFL, that we need to have affirmative action for white people. And all these guys are millionaires, right? And so I try and tell people, look, this is part of culture. Our culture celebrates entertainers, especially Black entertainers. And so that's where many of our millionaires have come from, right? And so we need to change our culture, get out of the victimization piece, and start thinking about how we can get more doctors and lawyers or welders for that matter. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is you want to do and find success in, and I think you'd agree with this, we should be looking about excellence and not necessarily equality.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is the biggest mistake in all of Black American history is the fact that we, in the beginning in the 60s, began to identify with our victimization as if it was the real us. To be authentically Black, you have to be a victim. That's why all these millionaire athletes who are not remotely victims, we all volunteer to be a victim like with their money. And yet, these absolutely free, wealthy people tip their hat to Black victimization in order to be accepted by Blacks. If LeBron James if he says to Blacks, hey, we're free, the door's wide open, we can become anything we want, then he feels they would call him and they would call him an Uncle Tom. They would say he's betraying his race, that he just looks out for himself, and they would put him down. So he treats us as though we're all afraid. Victimization is around every corner, and that we don't have a chance. That's how we collude with white guilt and with white racism. We sort of agree once again to go along with that view of us as inadequate, as inferior. Rather than say, don't give us anything, keep it, don't give us anything. We will earn our way. If the school down the street at the corner is not any good and is not educating your child, open up a classroom in your basement. Do what other groups have done. Take over, say, well, you're not educating our kids, we'll do it. In other words, get the job done. Get serious about being free. Until we do that, it doesn't matter what else society does for us. 60 years has proven that the government cannot lift us up. Only we can do that. Well, I'm happy these days because I think that consciousness is beginning to take hold in Black America. We're beginning to see the absolute futility of liberalism, the way it takes us for granted and so forth. And a healthy resentment is developing. Boy, I'd like to encourage that in every way I can. I hope this movie makes a little point here.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that. I was going to try and bring it back to the movie because like again, as I mentioned before, it's the death of Michael Brown that helps launch Black Lives Matter, and so this false narrative actually ends up launching a false movement that really isn't about Black lives. It's a political movement that wants to push gay and lesbianism and Marxism, and wants to destroy traditional families, and I mean they just want to deconstruct everything in Western society. So and the interesting thing is we've got corporations virtual signaling by giving all this money to them, because as you say in your books, and it seems to be a theme throughout your books, that white guilt. They're trying to prove that they're not racist, so they're going to give all this money without even bothering to look behind to see what's actually happening behind the movement, and how it's actually hurting Black people and not helping Black people one single bit.
When you don't really stand up for yourself, when you don't believe in your own genuine human equality, you're open to the seductive voices of all sorts of people who have their own interests. The white guilt causes whites to once again exploit us for their innocence. They get their innocence. They can now say, we had a Black president. We spent $22 trillion on social programs since the 60s. Right. We're not racist. And they're right, they're not racist. But all they did was about them, not about us. We're still behind, we're farther behind than we ever were. And it's heartbreaking to see us. This breaks my heart, it really does. To see young Black people in the streets talking about justice, this and when all around them is opportunity and freedom and possibilities that I certainly as a young man could never dream of, are now available to them. All they have to do is take responsibility for their own lives. And so when whites offer to take responsibility away from them, say thank you, but no thanks. You worry about your innocence, I'll worry about my development. Amen. We've got to develop. That's what we need. We're not guilty. We didn't oppress anybody. That's not our problem.
Well, look, I'm going to have to stop you here because we're, again, out of time. The time goes by so fast when we're having these discussions. And I appreciate your being here with us to talk about your movie. People need to go out and see a documentary, right? on Michael Brown to get the truth of what actually killed Michael Brown, and stop listening to what other people are saying who aren't interested in telling the truth. Thank you, Dr. Steele, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Never before in America's history has there been a more desperate need for a unified voice to fight against the moral decay of our nation. Liberal progressives are pushing an agenda to destroy Judeo-Christian values, and mainstream media and other institutions are promoting the depravity of our nation. At Freedom's Journal Institute, we stand with those who are becoming marginalized simply because of their biblical faith and values. Like you, we are troubled by the racial and political unrest in our society. With the launch of our new online community, the Alliance of Freedom Fighters, we have risen to the challenge in the battle for life, liberty, and the pursuit of holiness. When you join our community, you will get access to FJI's digital libraries and information sharing portals, the ability to collaborate with other Alliance Freedom Fighters on both national and local community projects and issues, as well as needed support, encouragement, and best practices to champion our shared ideas and values. Go to allianceoffreedomfighters.com and become a part of the Alliance.
Welcome back. In 1907, Bal Gangadhar Tilak addressed India's National Congress as India's nation struggled to shake off British imperial rule. Tilak and others were determined to achieve independence from Great Britain and to achieve self-rule as a nation and people. Tilak argued that independence was within the grasp of his countrymen, mainly because Britain's control over India was due, in fact, to those Indians responsible for assisting the British. He said, quote, "We have perceived one fact, that the whole of this administration, which is carried on by a handful of Englishmen, is carried on with our assistance," end quote. In other words, there were a handful of foreigners who ultimately controlled the destiny of millions, because millions allowed them. Thus, Tilak aptly expressed his people's cooperation with a foreign government as, quote, "instruments of our own oppression," end quote. Here's the quote in its context. Quote, "This whole government is carried on with our assistance, and they try to keep us in ignorance of our power of cooperation between ourselves, by which and that which is our own hands at present can be claimed by us and administered by us. Self-government is our goal. We want control over our administrative machinery. We don't want to become clerks and remain clerks. At present, we are clerks and willing instruments of our own oppression in the hands of an alien government, and that government is ruling over us, not by its innate strength, but by keeping us in ignorance and blindness to the perception of this fact," end quote. In this same manner, I believe a foreign government has taken control of the African American community's destiny. Since the 60s, many African American leaders have assumed the role of clerks, assisting in many respects the liberal progressives' control over the black community, to our obvious detriment. I've chosen to call liberals a foreign government because its progressive ideology is foreign to most African Americans' professed ideology. Progressives in general are anti-Christian, pro-same-sex marriage, pro-abortion, and support the status quo in education to the detriment of our children's instruction. Blacks have been led to believe that it is in our best interest to support a party that does not share or support our Christian values. Through Poetic Truth in the Michael Brown story, blacks have been lied to and manipulated by their emotions into following Black Lives Matter movement that only has a political Marxist and LGBT social agenda. We've been led to believe that stroking white guilt will garner us new privileges and prestige once denied. However, their goal is not the uplift of blacks, but the overthrow of the government. As we have said in other programs, they are trained Marxists who intend to deconstruct our society, marriage, family, and faith. Like the lie of the serpent in the book of Genesis, they have a hidden agenda. And like the first couple, they intend to establish for themselves what is good. Dr. Steele says, quote, "They chase utopian fairness like diversity, gender equity, sustainability, social justice, ecological balance, and multiculturalism. Vague projections that ring of good intentions for the future. At the same time, they admonish America for its past, end quote. The poetic truth of the Michael Brown case uses emotionalism to blot out critical thinking that would expose their insidious agenda. They seek to incite fear and anxiety. However, in Matthew chapter 6, during the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus instructs his disciples, after telling them they can't serve two masters, to not be anxious. He says in verse 25, not to be anxious about your life or the basic necessities of life. What you eat, drink, wear should not consume your thoughts. Verses 26 through 30 gives an illustration of the way God takes care of the birds, the lilies, and the grass. He then asks the question, how much more will he take care of you? The counsel is to have faith in verse 30. And in verse 31, he repeats the same ideas mentioned in verse 25. He says, quote, therefore, do not be anxious, saying, what shall I eat, or what shall I drink, or what shall I wear, end quote. Why? In verse 32, it says, for the Gentiles seek after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all, end quote. However, the answer is in verse 33. Instead of being anxious like the Gentiles, we are to, quote, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you, end quote. The crux of the argument is that the Pharisees were operating in their self-righteousness, just as the social justice warriors are operating in their own call for justice against America's past failings. They are seeking justice and asking Americans to act righteously without themselves being righteous. Poetic truth is not righteous. Thus, the believer is called on to seek the righteousness of God, not the anxiety of the Gentiles. In our case, the social justice warriors, whose self-righteousness is perverted. As we saw in Psalm 1, believers are warned not to walk, stand, or sit with those who have no appreciation for the Word of God. The wicked, the sinners, and the scoffers who don't meditate on the Word shall not be heeded. Black Lives Matter, Antifa, liberal progressives, and social justice warriors are the wicked, the sinners, and the scoffers of our day. They are not to be followed. You see, poetic truth is just another phrase for a lie. People who claim to want justice but never mention righteousness are not delighting in the word of the Lord. The death of Michael Brown is unfortunate, but it's time to stop permitting others to shape our destiny like the people in India. We will no longer be instruments of our own oppression. Quote, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of the sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. Let us heed the psalmist's instruction. Until next time, God bless.